At 71, the hardest thing wasn't losing my husband. It was watching my children laugh at what he left behind.
Caleb Virelle did not mean to reveal his father's secret. He only meant to humiliate his mother. At 71, Janet Virelle stood beside the rotting hut in Henderson County, North Carolina, while her children watched a demolition contractor measure the last place Elias had touched before he died. Raymond called it unsafe, Denise called it embarrassing, and Caleb laughed at the cracked pots near the door and said his father had wasted his final years growing weeds. Then he kicked one, the pot shattered, wet soil spilled across Janet's shoes. A thin sapling rolled out, bent at the stem, its small leaves crushed into the mud. No one stopped talking, no one cared, but Janet bent down, touched one torn leaf and froze. The smell rising from it was impossible, sharp, sweet, bitter at the end. The smell of her father's orchard, the one cut down when she was 12. Then Janet saw the tag tied to the stem. Ash Rose, Janet's tree, keep alive, and suddenly, the hut they wanted destroyed was not dead anymore. It was protecting something Elias had hidden for her. Subscribe now, because in a few minutes, Janet's own children will try to destroy the one living thing her husband died protecting. Caleb had broken the pot, but he had not broken the secret, not yet. Janet Virelle stayed beside the hut long after her children drifted back toward the house. The contractor had folded his measuring tape. Raymond was already on his phone, speaking low near the porch. Denise kept wiping mud from her shoe, as if the place itself had offended her. Only Janet remained still. The small sapling lay in the wet soil at her feet, bent, bruised, but alive. She lowered herself carefully, one hand on her knee, the other reaching for the torn leaves. Cold grass soaked the hem of her skirt. Mud pressed into the lines of her fingers. Then the smell rose again, sharp, sweet, bitter at the end. Janet closed her eyes. Not because she was weak, because she knew that smell. It belonged to her father's orchard outside Hendersonville. The ash rose apples had been small and red-gray, almost too plain to notice. But when her father sliced one open with his pocket knife, the scent filled the air like rain on warm bark. Then the farm was sold, the trees were cut down. And Janet learned, at 12 years old, that some losses did not scream. They just vanished while adults signed papers. Now, almost 60 years later, that same scent was rising from a broken pot outside a hut her children wanted destroyed. Janet looked toward the house. No one was watching. For once, they had dismissed her so completely. They did not notice she had stopped following their lead. She lifted the sapling with both hands and carried it inside. The hut door scraped across the floor. Damp wood, cold soil, old tin. At first glance, the place looked exactly like Raymond said. Cracked shelves, rusty cans, dirty plastic, buckets, sticks, torn burlap hanging from nails. But Elias had never been careless. That was the first thing their children had forgotten. He saved bent screws in baby food jars. He patched old gloves instead of buying new ones. He could make a broken chair hold another winter just by studying where the weight had shifted. So why would a man like that leave buckets scattered for no reason? Janet looked closer. One bucket sat beneath a steady roof drip. A second was covered with clean screen. The cracked pots faced the east window. The burlap was tied, not tossed, loose, careful, like something sleeping underneath needed protection. She stepped deeper into the hut. Then she noticed it. One shelf had less dust than the others, not clean, just disturbed. A drawer beneath the workbench sat open by half an inch, and near the leg of the bench, a faint muddy heel print marked the floor. Janet's chest tightened. Someone had been here. Not years ago, recently. On the shelf, she found more small pots. Thin stems rose from dark soil. Some were dry, some were bent. Two still held a stubborn green. Small tags hung from them in Elias's handwriting. Ash Rose, Janet's tree, keep alive. Janet gripped the shelf. All those evenings Elias came out here after supper. All those mornings he brushed dirt from his sleeves. All those times Raymond called it junk. Elias had been trying to bring back her father's tree. Near the workbench, beneath a coffee tin filled with nails, she found a black notebook. Her name was written inside. Janet, The pages were filled with dates, temperatures, watering notes, failed grafts. Then one sentence stopped her. If one survives, Janet will know her father's trees were not all lost. Her eyes burned. But she kept reading. The next page ended halfway down. The rest had been cut out with a blade. Clean, careful, deliberate. And on the last line Elias had written before the missing pages, Janet saw 8 words that turned the cold hut colder. If Raymond asks to tear it down, hide the living root. Janet stared at the torn paper. Outside, Raymond's voice carried across the yard. He was telling the contractor to come back Friday, and for the first time, Janet understood. Caleb had not accidentally revealed the secret. He had almost exposed the part someone was trying to destroy. Janet did not step away from the torn notebook. Raymond's voice still carried from the yard. Friday. That was the word that pressed against her ribs. Not when she was ready, not after she understood. Friday. The hut had 3 days left. She looked again at Elias's warning. If Raymond asks to tear it down, hide the living root. The living root. Janet did not know what that meant yet, but Elias had never used careless words. Not when he fixed things, not when he prayed, not when he wrote notes on the backs of envelopes and tucked them under coffee mugs so she would find them in the morning. If he wrote living root, then something in this hut mattered more than she understood. Janet closed the notebook and held it under her arm. Then she looked around again. This time, the hut changed. The first bucket was not just sitting under a leak. A thin strip of bent metal guided rainwater from the split roof into it. Beside it, a second bucket was covered with screen so nothing dirty could fall inside. She touched the rim. Cold water, clear water, saved water. At the east window, cracked glass had been covered with cloudy plastic. Raymond had called it ugly. Denise had called it embarrassing. But Janet saw the light now, soft, filtered, gentle enough not to burn the small stems lined beneath it. The pots were not scattered. They were waiting in the one place morning reached. She turned toward the burlap strips hanging from nails. They looked ragged from far away. But when Janet lifted one, she found small green stems behind it, shielded from the draft slipping through the wall boards. The burlap was not trash, it was protection. Like Elias's old coat draped over her shoulders on cold church mornings. A sound came from the roof. One slow drip, then another. The drops landed in the bucket with a patient rhythm. Janet stood listening. It felt less like an abandoned shed now, and more like something still breathing. Under the lower shelf, shallow boxes sat half hidden in shadow. Janet knelt and brushed aside the top layer of damp sand. Thin wrapped cuttings lay beneath it. Each one had a small label. Some were dark and failed, some had dried at the ends. But one showed a faint green line under the bark. Janet touched it with the care of someone touching a sleeping child. Elias had been fighting for life in inches. A little shade, a little water, a little warmth, a little time. She moved toward the back corner, where an old stovepipe rose crooked through the roof. The stove was cold, but bricks had been stacked around the pipe in a half circle. Janet placed her palm near them. The bricks held a weak warmth from the afternoon sun, barely enough to notice, but enough for a man who knew frost could kill quietly. Enough for a man trying to keep something alive with scraps and patience. The children had seen disorder. Janet saw design. The hut had been built wrong on purpose. Its flaws had become Elias's tools. The leak fed the water. The broken window softened the light. The burlap held back the wind. The sand kept the cuttings damp. The bricks saved a little warmth. A poor man's greenhouse, hidden beneath rot and ridicule. Janet opened the notebook again. Near the middle, Elias had drawn a rough map of the hut. Not beautiful, not neat, but careful. East light, cold wall, rain catch, warm corner, dry shelf. Then, in the bottom margin, half smudged by his thumb, she found another line. Do not move the living root before the last frost. Janet looked toward the cracked window. The late winter sky outside had begun to darken. Last frost, that meant time mattered. Not just the demolition, the weather, the season. The life inside the hut was depending on conditions Elias had built with his own tired hands. Then the floor gave a soft creak behind her. Janet turned. No one was inside. But through the cloudy plastic covering the window, a shape stood outside still, close, watching. Janet held the notebook tighter, And for the first time since Caleb broke the pot, she wondered if the person who had cut out the missing pages had come back to see what else she had found. Janet had been inside the hut for what felt like hours, moving slowly from shelf to shelf, examining each pot, each strip of burlap, each tiny tag that Elias had written in his careful, slanted hand. She could feel the weight of the season pressing against the thin walls. The late winter air was colder than she expected, slipping in through cracks and gaps. She bent over a shallow tray of sand, brushing aside the top layer to reveal the cuttings beneath. One of them was pale but stubbornly green, a little life that had survived the winter, protected by her husband's careful arrangements. Her fingers lingered over it. She could almost feel Elias watching, his hands steady, guiding her even now. Then a sudden breeze swept through the hut. The door had shifted. She froze. It was cracked open just a few inches, letting a thin shaft of light across the dirt floor. Her heart tightened. She had closed it herself. No one else should have touched it. Janet's eyes scanned the floor. There were faint prints, small, narrow, and wet, fresh. Someone had been here, and they had moved things. A pot was tilted differently than she remembered. A burlap flap was lifted. Nothing stolen, nothing taken, just touched, examined, tested. Her mind raced. Could it have been Raymond, Caleb, or someone else entirely? Her children had laughed at this hut, as if it were nothing. But if someone understood even a fraction of what Elias had been building, they could ruin it in minutes. Janet's gaze returned to the cuttings. The fragile green stems swayed slightly in the draft. One knocked against the side of the tray. She steadied it with her hand. She went toward the door. The cold slipped inside with her. Outside, the yard looked ordinary, empty, no one moving, no footsteps, just the faint rustle of the wind, and yet she knew someone had been watching her. Watching the hut, watching her. The thought made her shiver. Elias had warned her to protect the living root. Now she understood. The threat wasn't just the demolition. It was that someone had already come before her. Someone who knew enough to touch the delicate arrangements without breaking them completely. Janet moved back inside, closing the door as quietly as she could. Her fingers lingered over the latch. She pressed her cheek against the rough wood. She could feel the pulse of the hut, the drip of water into the buckets, the faint warmth near the stovepipe, the subtle tilt of sunlight falling across the row of tiny stems. Each element carefully orchestrated, vulnerable, fragile, alive. Her heart beat faster as she imagined what would happen if the hut were left unattended for a few more hours. The draft could kill the weak cuttings. The wrong touch could bend the fragile stems permanently. The living root could fail before she even knew its significance. Janet moved to the black notebook, flipping it open where the missing pages began. The cut edges were stark against the yellowed paper. Someone had taken them, cleanly, with purpose. She traced the edge with her fingers, and a chill ran through her. The missing notes weren't just records. They were instructions. Elias had trusted her to find them, and now someone had tried to take that trust from her. She sat on the floor, notebook in her lap, eyes drifting to the leaning workbench in the corner. The leg of it, still wrapped in old wax cloth, seemed darker than she remembered. Her fingers itched to check it, but she paused. Something told her she needed to understand the whole pattern first before touching it. The hut, for all its quiet, contained too many secrets. She realized she wasn't simply observing. She was being tested. Watching the work of a man who had spent his last years protecting a piece of her past, hidden in plain sight. And now she knew, whoever had come before, whoever had touched the things Elias left behind, had only made the stakes higher. Janet looked at the faint light crossing the floor, the swaying cuttings, the tilted pots. Her chest tightened. She whispered his name, Elias. And then, from somewhere outside, a shadow moved, slow, intentional. Watching the hut, waiting, calculating. Janet held the notebook tighter. The hut was no longer just a shed, it was a battlefield. And she realized she was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. Someone knew the secret of the living root, and now they were back. The question hung in the air. Would Janet discover who and what they wanted before it was too late? Janet did not sleep that night. The hut felt heavier after the shadow outside. She moved slowly, barefoot on the cold floorboards, notebook pressed to her chest. Every drip of water, every whisper of wind through the cracks, sounded louder than it should. She knew she needed help, not from her children, not from anyone in the county office who would see her as sentimental. She needed someone who understood the work Elias had done. The phone number in the back of the notebook called itself now. Dr. Maren Holt, retired orchard specialist, a woman Elias had trusted, a woman who might still know the ash rose. Janet hesitated. She had never met Maren, never spoken more than 2 sentences. But desperation outweighed fear. By morning, she was driving the narrow mountain roads of Henderson County, past the rolling hills and bare orchards of early spring. Each mile was heavier than the last, her hands gripping the wheel as if letting go would unravel everything Elias had hidden. She pulled up to a small white farmhouse at the edge of the county line. Maren opened the door before Janet could knock. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. "I've been expecting you," Maren said, almost a whisper. Janet felt relief and suspicion at the same time. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and faint earth. Maren did not smile. She led Janet to a work table where several labeled grafts were drying in shallow trays. Janet laid out the small pots and the notebook. She explained the broken pot, the saplings, the strange tags, the torn pages. She did not embellish. She did not cry, she just told the truth. Maren moved quietly, examining each plant, each tag. She lifted the burlap and peered under the trays. She touched the thin stems gently, as though disturbing them too roughly could undo decades of care. "This," Maren said finally, voice low, "your husband did not fool around. He knew exactly what he was doing. These are not random seedlings, they are grafts, carefully nurtured, fragile, almost gone from the region entirely." Janet swallowed hard. A tight ache rose in her chest. "Why would he hide them like this?" she asked. "Because he trusted you to recognize them," Maren said. "He didn't just want to grow apples. He wanted you to see them, to understand, to act." The weight of it hit Janet. Elias had built the hut not as storage, not as clutter, not as a shrine. He had built it as a living memory. But then Maren's eyes narrowed. She pointed to a faint pencil mark in the notebook, a scribble Janet had overlooked before. "Do you see this?" Maren asked. "Your husband contacted me months before he died. He mentioned a cyan bundle, original root material for the ash rose. He never sent it. Someone else must have moved it. Someone who knew enough to be careful." Janet's hands tightened around the notebook. Someone had been inside the hut. Someone had found the living root. Someone had already taken it. Her breath caught. Outside, the wind pushed against the farmhouse, rattling the window panes. Janet could almost hear the cold night drifting back from the mountains to the hut. Maren placed a hand on her shoulder. "If you want to save this, we have to move fast. The grafts are alive, but vulnerable. Every day they stay in the wrong conditions. They risk dying before anyone can confirm their value." Janet nodded slowly, trying to let the information settle, letting the urgency fill her chest. She looked out the window toward the hills, toward the hut that her children were already plotting to demolish. Time was no longer a gentle friend, it was a hammer. And Janet realized, with a cold certainty, that the person who had tampered with the notebook, who had left the hut door ajar the night before, might return before she could even take the first step to protect what Elias had left alive. Her hands shook slightly as she lifted the notebook again. She knew the next decision would determine everything. Someone else knows the secret of the grafts. Janet has helped now. But will it arrive in time to stop whoever is trying to erase Elias's work forever? The living root hangs in the balance. Janet reached home before noon. The house looked too quiet. That was the first thing that troubled her. No contractor truck, no voices in the yard, no Caleb laughing too loudly to cover what he did not understand. Just the old farmhouse sitting under a pale Henderson County sky, with the hut behind it leaning in the distance like it was holding its breath. Janet parked near the porch and stepped out with Dr. Maren Holt's words still moving through her mind. The grafts are alive, but vulnerable. Every day matters. She had barely reached the front steps when she saw Raymond sitting inside her kitchen. Not standing, not waiting politely, sitting, as if the house had already begun answering to him. A manila folder lay on the table beside his coffee cup. Janet stopped in the doorway. For a second, she saw Elias in that same chair years ago, shelling beans into a bowl while rain tapped the windows. He never sat at that table like he owned her. He sat there like he belonged beside her. Raymond looked up and smiled. Too calm, too practiced. He said he did not want another argument. He said everyone was worried about her. He said the old place was becoming too much for one woman to manage. Janet took off her coat slowly. She did not answer. Raymond opened the folder. Inside were papers clipped together with yellow tabs. A property evaluation, a buyer's letter, a demolition estimate, and a simple line at the top that made Janet's fingers go cold. Recommended removal of unsafe outbuilding before final sale. Outbuilding. That was what they had reduced Elias's hut to. Not a workshop, not a nursery. Not the last place his hands had made something live. An outbuilding. Raymond slid the papers toward her. He told her the offer was generous, more than fair. He said the developer wanted to move quickly before interest rates changed again. He said she could have a smaller place near Asheville, somewhere clean, warm, easy. Then his voice softened. That was the part Janet trusted least. He said Elias had not been himself near the end. He said grief could make people see meaning where there was only clutter. He said sometimes love made people hold on to things that needed to be let go. Janet looked at her son, really looked at him, the boy who once ran barefoot through summer grass. The man now asking her to sign away the ground beneath the last thing his father protected. She touched the edge of the folder but did not pull it closer. Her voice stayed low. She told him she would not sign. Raymond's smile held for 1 second too long. Then it thinned. He said she was making this harder than it needed to be. He said Denise was worried. He said Caleb thought she was being manipulated by an old woman from the county line. Janet knew he meant Marin. So he knew she had called someone. That small fact passed through her like a cold wire. Raymond leaned forward. His tone changed again. Not angry, worse, patient. Like he was speaking to someone who could no longer be trusted with her own life. He said the hut would come down Friday, whether she made peace with it or not. Then he tapped one page with his finger. Janet looked down. Near the bottom, in neat black print, was a phrase she had not seen before. Occupant has shown emotional attachment to unsafe structure and may resist removal. Occupant. Not mother, not owner, not Janet. Occupant. The word landed harder than a shout. Someone had already written her out of her own home. Raymond kept talking, but Janet no longer heard the full sentences. She saw only the words on the paper. Unsafe structure. Emotional attachment. May resist. And beneath the final page, a copy of a complaint form, filed 3 weeks earlier. Before Caleb broke the pot. Before Janet found the notebook. Before anyone had admitted what they wanted. The signature line had been partly covered by Raymond's thumb. But when he shifted his hand, Janet saw enough. Not the whole name, just the first letter, R. Raymond closed the folder quickly, too quickly. Janet lifted her eyes to him. For the first time, he looked away. And in that quiet kitchen, with Elias's hut still standing beyond the window, Janet understood something terrible. Raymond had not started this because the hut was dangerous. He had started it because he was afraid of what Elias had left inside. Raymond left the folder on the kitchen table. He said he would come back for it later. But Janet knew better. He wanted it to stay there. Wanted those words to sit in her house like a threat. Unsafe structure. Emotional attachment. May resist removal. For a long moment, Janet stood beside the table without touching the papers. Then she walked to the window. Beyond the backfield, the hut leaned under the gray afternoon light. From the kitchen it looked small, tired, easy to dismiss. But now Janet knew it was neither empty nor accidental. And if Raymond had filed that complaint weeks before, then Elias's warning had not been fear. It had been foresight. Janet picked up the phone and called Marin. She did not explain everything. She only adds Raymond had moved faster than they thought. Marin arrived less than an hour later, carrying a canvas bag and wearing boots still marked with red clay from her own place near the county line. She did not waste time with comfort. That was what Janet needed most, not pity, action. Together they walked to the hut before the light faded. The yard was quiet, but Janet felt watched. Every window in the farmhouse seemed too dark. Every bare branch near the fence looked like it could be hiding someone's eyes. Inside the hut, Maren stopped near the doorway and let her gaze travel over Elias's strange little world. The buckets, the covered trays, the shaded shelves, the damp sandboxes. Then she turned to Janet. The original scion, she said softly, would not be stored like a document. Elias would have kept it alive. Janet looked toward the shelves. Maren shook her head. Not there. Too exposed. She checked behind the burlap, then under the sand trays, then near the water barrels. Nothing. The hut darkened around them. Rain began tapping softly against the tin roof, and each drop sounded like time running out. Janet opened Elias's notebook again. The missing pages gave her nothing, but one line remained. Hide the living root. Janet read it under her breath. Maren heard her and went still. Say that again. Janet repeated it. Maren's eyes moved across the hut, not searching like a visitor anymore, but thinking like Elias. If he called it living, she said, he would have protected it from drying out. If he called it root, he would have kept it cool, stable, damp. Janet felt something stir in her memory, not a clear answer, a small ache, a picture. Elias at the workbench the winter before he died, his back bent, one hand pressed against the bench as he coughed into a cloth. Raymond had come in once and leaned against the bench, careless and heavy. Elias had snapped at him. Not loudly, but sharply enough that everyone remembered. Don't put your weight there. At the time, Janet thought Elias was protecting the old bench. Now she looked at it differently. The workbench stood at the back of the hut, scarred by years of use. Its top was stained with oil, soil, and rings from coffee cups. 3 legs were pale and dry. But the fourth was darker near the bottom, wrapped with old wax cloth. Janet walked toward it. Maren followed. Neither of them spoke. Janet touched the cloth. It was not decoration. It was sealed tight. Maren knelt beside her and opened her canvas bag. She took out a small knife, then paused. Only if you are ready, she said. Janet looked at the bench, at the place Elias had stood for years, at the tool marks his hands had left behind. Then she nodded. Maren cut the wax cloth carefully. A damp smell rose from inside the wood, not rot, moss. The bench leg had been hollowed, lined, packed, protected like a small hidden room made for something too fragile to survive in the open. Maren reached in slowly and pulled out a narrow bundle wrapped in wax paper and sphagnum moss. Janet's breath caught. The bundle was no bigger than a rolled dish towel. Maren laid it on the bench and peeled back the first layer. Several thin cuttings rested inside. Some were brown, some dry, one looked ruined. But near the center, tucked deeper into the moss, one slender piece still held a faint green shine beneath the bark. Maren touched it with the back of her finger. Her voice dropped. This one may still be alive. Janet gripped the edge of the bench. For a moment the hut disappeared. She saw Elias's hands instead, tired hands, swollen at the knuckles, still working, still hiding life inside wood, moss, and silence. Then Maren found a folded scrap pressed into the wax paper. The pencil marks were faint, but readable. If this lives, so does her orchard. Janet lowered herself onto the old stool. She did not sob. She simply covered her mouth and breathed through the ache. Because Elias had not left her grief. He had left her a chance, a living piece of the past, a fragile answer to a loss she had carried since childhood. Maren rewrapped the cutting quickly. We have to stabilize this tonight, she said, and we need the county to see it before anyone moves this bench. Janet wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. She was about to answer when headlights swept across the cracked window. Both women froze. A truck rolled slowly into the yard. The engine stopped. Then came the sound of a door opening. Heavy footsteps crossed the wet grass toward the hut. Janet knew that walk. Raymond had come back. And this time, he was not alone. Raymond's headlights stayed on. They cut through the cloudy plastic of the hut window and turned every bucket, every shelf, every hanging strip of burlap into a long black shape. Janet did not move. Maren had already slipped the living cutting back into its moss and wax paper. Her hands were calm, but her face had changed. Outside, another door opened. Not Denise, not Caleb. A stranger. A man's voice carried across the wet yard, low and impatient. Raymond answered him in the same careful tone he had used at Janet's kitchen table. Reasonable, polished, dangerous. Janet stepped to the workbench and placed her palm flat over the hollowed leg, as if Elias could feel her there. Marin moved toward the door first. Janet followed. When the hut door opened, Raymond stood in the rain with a man in a dark jacket and work boots. Behind them, the truck idled beside the ruts in the grass. Raymond's eyes went straight past Janet, straight to the workbench. He saw the cut waxcloth, he saw Marin's canvas bag, and for one small second his face gave him away. Not anger, fear. Then he covered it. He told Janet he had come to check on her. He said neighbors had noticed activity around the unsafe structure. He said he did not want anyone getting hurt before Friday. The man beside him introduced himself as someone working with the developer's clearing crew. Not the county, not an inspector, a clearing crew. Janet felt the difference immediately. Raymond had not come to check on her. He had come to see what she had found. Marin stepped closer, blocking part of the doorway. She told them no one would be entering the hut that night. Raymond's smile tightened. He said Janet had no idea what she was getting herself into. He said old plant scraps and family memories would not stop a legal sale. That was when Marin looked at him and said the one word Raymond had not expected: preservation. The rain seemed to go quiet for a moment. Marin explained that the grafts and scion material could qualify for emergency review if there was evidence of a rare regional heirloom variety. She did not exaggerate. She did not promise riches. She only stated enough truth to change the room around them. Raymond's face hardened. He said there was already a complaint on file. Janet looked at him. So did Marin. Raymond realized too late what he had admitted. The next morning, Janet and Marin went to the county office in Hendersonville. Janet wore her good gray coat, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because Elias had always said hard days deserved clean buttons. The clerk behind the counter was polite, but distant, until Marin placed her credentials on the desk and asked for the complaint attached to Janet's property. The folder came out thin. Too thin for something that was supposed to decide the fate of a building. Inside was a form filed 3 weeks earlier, before the broken pot, before Janet found the notebook, before Raymond pretended the demolition was only about safety. The complaint described the hut as an abandoned outbuilding containing organic debris, standing water, mold risk, and unstable materials. Then Janet saw the phrase that made her stomach tighten: plant matter to be removed before structure clearing. Not preserved, not examined, removed. The signature at the bottom was no longer covered by Raymond's thumb. There it was in full. Raymond Virelle. Janet stared at her son's name. Marin gently turned another page. A second document was clipped behind it. It was a preliminary inquiry from the developer, asking whether demolition could proceed before final transfer if the family provided consent. Family consent, not Janet's consent. Family, the word told its own story. Raymond had been building a path around her before she even knew there was a path. Janet did not cry in that office. She did not raise her voice. She simply asked the clerk for copies of everything. Her voice was steady enough that the woman behind the counter finally looked at her differently. Not like an old woman clinging to a shed, like an owner, like someone waking up. Marin filed the emergency preservation request before they left the building. But the clerk warned them it might not be reviewed until Monday. Janet looked at Marin. The demolition was Friday. And as they stepped outside into the cold afternoon, Janet's phone buzzed. A message from Caleb. Only 5 words: "Mom, don't go home yet." Dawn broke cold and gray over Henderson County. Janet drove slowly along the gravel lane toward the hut. The air smelled faintly of wet pine and thawing soil. Each step she took out of the car felt heavier than the last. The notebook was tucked under her arm. The moss-wrapped cutting rested in Marin's canvas bag. She stopped at the corner where the grass dipped into mud. There, tire tracks had formed overnight. Fresh. Deep. Someone had already been preparing the yard. She swallowed hard. Inside the hut, the small green stems rested in their trays, protected by burlap, sand, and the carefully guided shafts of light through the cracked plastic. Elias had built this place wrong on purpose, each flaw a defense. But nothing could stop a demolition crew determined to ignore reason. Janet did not speak. Maren watched silently, her eyes scanning the surroundings. The faint hum of a diesel engine reached them before the first headlights appeared around the bend. The truck rolled in slowly, large, metal, hungry. Its bed was empty now, but it would not be for long. Raymond stepped out first, holding a clipboard, the same calm smile masking impatience. Behind him, two men in reflective vests followed, carrying equipment. One of them glanced at the hut and frowned. Janet's chest tightened. The truck stopped a few feet from the doorway. Mud splashed against the tires as the men stepped down. They moved carefully, almost as if they sensed the tension, but the threat was clear. Every step brought them closer to the living cuttings Elias had hidden. Maren nudged Janet gently. "We need to show them this is not junk," she whispered. Janet nodded. Not with words. She walked forward, hand brushing the edge of the workbench, feeling the hollow leg beneath her fingers. The green cutting inside rested quietly, alive, unaware of the danger approaching. Raymond opened his clipboard. He read aloud the same lines Janet had already seen. Unsafe in structure, emotional attachment, removal recommended. Caleb and Denise had not arrived yet. For a brief moment it was just her son, and the strangers who would obey his command. Janet stepped closer to the center of the hut. Her boots made soft taps on the dirt floor. She ran her eyes over the trays. Each leaf, each stem, each moss-wrapped cutting was a promise, a memory, a fragment of Elias's love. She bent slightly, touching the tallest cutting gently. Her fingers lingered on the tiny leaves. They were delicate, vulnerable, waiting. Raymond spoke again, his tone polite, almost conversational. "Mom, it's just a shed. We don't need to make this harder than it is." Janet's eyes did not leave the workbench. She did not reply. The crew glanced at her. The silence was thick. One man shifted his weight, uncertain. Maren cleared her throat. She stepped forward. "This is not a shed," she said. Her voice was steady, calm, but carried weight. "This is a heritage grafting site. These plants are rare. Destroying them could be a violation, and you could face serious consequences." Raymond's jaw tightened. The polite mask wavered. "You're exaggerating," he said. Maren shook her head. "I'm not, and you know it." For a moment, Janet felt a flicker of hope. The men paused. The diesel engine hummed low. Every second stretched. Then a sudden gust rattled the hut's roof. Dust fell from the rafters. A thin branch tapped against the plastic-covered window. Janet's heart skipped. One of the crew stepped closer to the first bucket. A drop of rain fell from the tin roof above and landed inside. Her fingers tightened around the notebook tucked under her arm. She whispered Elias's name. The men looked at her strangely now. Respect? Uncertainty? Raymond's eyes darted to the workbench. The wax cloth covering the leg was slightly frayed from Maren adjusting it. He took a step toward it. Janet felt her breath catch. This was the moment she had feared. If he touched it now, it would undo years of careful work. She glanced at Maren, who gave a small nod. Janet raised her hand slowly, not to strike, not to plead, but to claim what was hers. The crew froze, the truck idled in the yard. Raymond's fingers hovered over the workbench leg, and Janet realized with a jolt, this was more than a test, it was a choice. One wrong move, and everything Elias had hidden, the living root, the grafts, the promise, would be gone before anyone outside this hut could see it. She swallowed hard. And then the first man from the crew stepped closer, tools in hand, clearly about to do what Raymond intended. Janet's chest tightened, time stopped. And in that silent heartbeat, she understood that saving the living root might mean standing against her own son. One step, one touch, one careless move could destroy decades of careful work. Janet's next choice would decide not just the fate of the hut, but whether the living root survived. The first light of morning spilled across the hut, thin and gray, slipping through the cracked plastic of the east window. Janet stood barefoot on the cold boards, holding the notebook and watching the small green cutting wrapped in moss. It had survived. The moment of recognition was quiet. She did not shout. She did not fall to her knees. She only exhaled slowly, letting the air out of her lungs in a long, trembling sigh. The living root, fragile and stubborn, was still alive. Maren knelt beside the tray, gently brushing away a stray leaf. "It's responding," she whispered. "See the faint shine along the bark? That's growth. Life. Janet's fingers hovered over the green tip. The room smelled faintly of damp soil, moss, and the faint trace of Elias's hands. She closed her eyes and felt the ache of decades, a lost orchard, lost time, lost years of quiet faith in her husband. And now, here it was again growing. Outside, the yard was quiet. Raymond had not appeared. Perhaps he was waiting. Perhaps he was planning. Janet did not know. She only knew that for the first time in months, she felt her heartbeat move forward, not backward. The day passed slowly. Janet and Marin worked carefully to stabilize the grafts. They adjusted burlap to shield the weak stems. They checked the temperature near the stovepipe. Every detail mattered. Each one was life. By mid-afternoon, Janet dared to look at the other trays. A few cuttings had failed, their brown tips curling like paper left in the sun. But most had survived. Some even showed the first hints of a bud, faintly green against the dark soil. Her hand rested over the workbench. The hollow leg had been resealed carefully after Marin had examined the moss bundle. Janet traced the wax cloth lightly, feeling the faint pulse of possibility beneath it. Elias had known this moment might come. He had built it so that life could endure, even if others failed to understand. The rain from the previous night had left small puddles in the floorboards. Janet dipped a rag in one and gently watered the surviving cuttings. Each drop was deliberate, almost reverent. She thought of the orchard of her childhood, the crooked rows her father had tended with patient hands. The memory sharpened the moment, making it feel larger than herself. Evening came and the light shifted, casting long shadows across the hut. Janet leaned against the doorframe, exhausted but alive in a way she had not been for years. She looked at Marin. "Do you think they'll understand?" she asked quietly. Marin shook her head. "They don't need to understand yet. You need to protect it first. Then, eventually, they will." A sudden movement outside made Janet's chest tighten. The shadows of the trees shifted. The wind carried a faint sound of tires crunching gravel. She froze, listening. A figure approached. Not running, not hiding, walking with purpose. Janet did not recognize it immediately. The headlights of a vehicle glinted across the field, catching the edge of a small trailer. Someone was coming to the hut. Janet's stomach tightened. She realized that though the grafts had survived the cold and the night, they were still vulnerable. And whoever was approaching had the power to undo everything Elias had built, everything she had fought to protect. She glanced at Marin, who gave a small nod. Janet gripped the notebook, steadying herself. She would not leave the hut, not now. The figure stepped closer, and the wind carried a faint metallic click. A key? A tool? Janet could not tell. Her eyes narrowed. The living root, the fragile promise of the ash rose, depended on what happened next. And she realized with a cold clarity, someone was about to test whether she was worthy of protecting it. The first green bud had appeared, but the next move, whoever approached, could destroy it all. Janet could feel the weight of every step in the grass. The living root, Elias's secret, and her chance to honor him hung in the balance. The figure stopped at the edge of the yard. Janet held the notebook tight. For one breath, she thought it was Raymond again. Another attempt, another paper. Another reason to make her feel small in the place she had paid for with 40 years of quiet work. But when the truck door opened, it was not Raymond who stepped into the grass. It was the county preservation officer. Behind him came Marin's assistant from the extension office, carrying 2 insulated plant boxes and a folded tarp. Janet did not move at first. She had spent so many days bracing for harm that help felt almost unfamiliar. The officer walked slowly, careful not to step near the trays. He looked at the hut, the roof, the buckets, the plastic-covered window, the burlap, the workbench. Then he looked at Janet, not past her, not through her, at her. He asked if she was the property owner. Janet lifted her chin. For the first time in weeks, the answer did not tremble. Yes, she was. Inside the hut, Marin showed him the grafts, the tags, the notebook, the cut pages, the moss-wrapped cyanwood. The strange, careful system Elias had built from things other people had laughed at. The officer did not call it junk. He called it evidence. That single word settled over Janet like sunlight. Evidence that Elias had known what he was doing. Evidence that the hut had purpose. evidence that Janet had not been clinging to rot. By afternoon, the demolition order was paused. By evening, the contractor had removed his markers from the grass. By the next week, Raymond's agreement with the developer had begun to fall apart. Not all at once. Not like thunder, more like ice cracking beneath the weight of its own lie. Denise came by first. She stood near the porch with her arms folded, unable to look toward the hut for more than a few seconds. Her apology was small, awkward, half-swallowed, but Janet heard it. Caleb came 2 days later. He brought a new clay pot. He left it by the door without a word. Janet did not pretend everything was healed. Some wounds do not close because someone finally feels sorry. But she no longer needed their understanding to know what was true. Spring came slowly to Henderson County. The cold loosened, the ground softened. Neighbors who had once driven past the leaning hut began stopping near the fence. Some came with tools. Some came with stories about old trees their grandparents used to grow. One man brought cedar boards. A young woman from the extension office brought printed labels. The hut was repaired, not made fancy, not turned into something it had never been. The roof still had its old slope. The workbench stayed in the back corner. The east window was patched with proper glass, but Janet asked them to leave the cloudy edge where Elias had filtered the light. A small wooden sign was placed outside, the Elias and Janet Virelle Heritage Grafting Shed. Janet ran her fingers over the letters, her name beside his, not hidden, not forgotten, beside his. The strongest ash rose graft was planted in a protected row behind the hut. Marin stood with her. So did a few neighbors. Denise came quietly. Caleb stood farther back. Raymond did not come. Janet noticed, then she let the noticing pass. Because this day was not about the people who almost destroyed it. It was about the life that had survived them. Weeks later, on a soft morning after rain, Janet walked to the young tree alone. The first bloom had opened, small, pale, almost shy. She touched the air beside it, not the petals. And for a moment she smelled her father's orchard again. Not as a wound this time, as a return. Elias had not left her a fortune that could be counted in a bank. He left her something better. A reason to stand, a reason to wake early, a reason to keep her hands in the soil and her name in the story. Her children had mocked the hut because they only saw what was old. But Janet had found what was alive, and at 71, she finally understood that her life had not ended when people stopped seeing her. It had only been waiting for the right season to bloom. If this story touched you, like the video, and subscribe before another truth like Janet's gets buried by people who think age makes someone invisible. And tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven Raymond or let silence be his punishment?